Order, and welcome to today's Energy Security and Net Zero Select Committee session on workforce planning, which will allow us to explore key themes so far under the inquiry from the point of view of employers, entrepreneurs and trade unions directly involved in the clean energy mission and the decarbonisation of buildings. We have first panel in front of us, and I'll ask you to introduce yourselves very briefly before we start with some questions. So if I start with you, who are you and where are you from?
Thank you, I'm Jodie. I'm the Director of People and Change at Northern Powergrid.
You're very welcome.
And I'm Sue Ferns, I'm the Senior Deputy General Secretary at Prospect Trade Union.
Well, thank you both very much indeed. And I'll start with a questioning. How much of an impact would you expect a national workforce strategy to have? And how quickly would you expect to see it make a practical difference for employers and for workers? Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to go first on that one. From a network company's point of view, anything that helps enable development of skills across the UK is super helpful. I think the key for us is unlocking that investability in the long term, which gives our company certainty to enable us to deliver, and that deliverability piece is really important, and I see that very much as industry's job to deliver, but of course some government policy and around skills and things like that would be great enablers to that.
Right, and Sue Ferns, National Workforce Strategy?
I think the National Workforce Strategy is really important. It's good to see that DESNZ and the Office for Clean Energy Jobs have committed to a workforce strategy. I think it's really important because of the scale of demand for skills is such that it won't just be met by companies or the market alone. Obviously, companies have an important role to play in this, but we're going to need a lot more skilled people in the clean energy sector than we have at the moment, so we need a strategy about how to achieve that. As Jodie has said, I don't think it's a piece on its own. It has to go along with the industrial strategy, creating the certainty for investors not only in infrastructure but also in the skills that they will need to deliver that new infrastructure.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And you mentioned the Office for Clean Energy Jobs, Sue Ferns. What would success look like for the Office for Clean Energy Jobs?
In terms of a workforce strategy?
Yeah.
So they've committed to publishing one. So the first thing is we need to see that strategy. The strategy should deal with the sprint that's required to achieve Clean Power 2030, but it should also set out a plan for the longer term. So I think a strategy is really important. It shouldn't stop us delivering what we can deliver in the short term. What would success look like? We would like to see, as we said in our evidence, the Office for Clean Energy Jobs develop from a unit within DESNZ to a centre of excellence on workforce strategy and skills, where it's also, perhaps a little bit into the future, becomes a centre of expertise in enabling just transition to happen as well. I think what would success look like by 2030, I think what we would want to see is a workforce strategy which has national dimensions but very clear evidence of it delivering in regions and localities, delivering good, clean jobs. So I think from our point of view, it would be a good idea for the Office for Clean Energy Jobs to select at least a couple of localities which are key in terms of the clusters here. For example, if you think about the northeast coast where there's offshore wind, there's potential for CCUS and hydrogen. There's a real potential there by focusing in that way to actually get on and deliver some of those jobs. And I think that will be a very tangible, a real indicator of success, which will give broader confidence as well.
Thank you. So locating the Office for Clean Energy Jobs or having locations where the need is greatest, using the clusters as a base. That's your
Yeah, I think you need an overarching national strategy, but I think in terms of delivery, using the clusters as a base is a very pragmatic way forward.
Thanks very much. Anything to add, Jodie?
Yeah, I agree with Sue around it would be really good to get a hold of that strategy as soon as possible. We have a huge transition, a huge amount of investment to get through to enable the clean power. And I think getting, from an industry's perspective, getting a hold of that is just really helpful because it will help us guide the investment we make in skills and the resources needed, and also igniting the supply chain to help deliver as well. But I also agree on the need for a long-term approach. The development of skills takes decades, it's not years. On average, to get a skilled worker in the distribution network takes about 3 to 5 years, and that doesn't include the time taken to attract and appoint them and get them into those jobs. So anything in terms of workforce strategy has to take account of a sort of 10-year plus approach rather than just some short-term measures.
That's interesting. And so you're looking at 10 years. Are there immediate wins that you would like to see as well?
Yeah, definitely. Some of the specific stuff that we would call for is around some of the flexibility in the growth and skills levy. We were really pleased to see the recent reform on minimum 9 months, which has been reduced, which is very helpful. But a lot of what we see in terms of the workforce that's coming into our organisation, in terms of new talent pool, is in the reskilling, career moving space, and actually much shorter modular type accredited training would be much more helpful in that space, and that lends itself to the skills passports sort of idea, which we are very open to, because that will enable that transition to be much smoother, particularly around the flexibility and the growth and skills levy as an example.
Thank you. And Sue Ferns, in your experience, how effective has the delivery of skills been when managed at local government level?
I think local government level is really important in terms of trust in local authorities as a long-term stable partner in their communities. I think the issue has been the resources available for them to be able to deliver skills at the scale needed. So I think the potential is there, but I think they've been quite constrained in what they've been able to do. But I also think it depends what skills you're talking about. So if you talk about skills for retrofit, for example, which are very much locally focused, then clearly local government has got a role to play. Some of the skills we're talking about in this space are not going to be delivered by local authorities. They're national specialist skills. So I think that they need to work in complementary to each other.
Thanks very much. And Jodie Coe, I think you were starting to answer the question I had in mind next about a more flexible training system where a good degree of it's tailored to local needs. Is that what you had in mind, what you were saying just now?
Yes, indeed. In building on Sue's point around local skills delivery, we all already in industry work in partnership with local education providers to help complement our own training. We're strong advocates for employer-led training because we can make it specific to the needs of certainly the network companies. But in terms of that flexibility, indeed, what we're calling for is allowing us to draw down those levy funds to help us support those more smaller modular-led type training opportunities for folk who are either wanting to reskill internally or coming from outside of our industry in.
Yeah, I mean, there is some suggestion that the kind of approach you're advocating could lead to an unnecessary additional complexity in hiring workers. What do you say to that?
I would disagree, actually. I think it makes it much simpler, because if you come with, let's say, a skills passport that has a list of skills that can be transferable, what the flexible approach to the apprenticeship levy, the use of the growth and skills levy, allows us to do is fill those gaps much more quickly and much more specifically, which enables them to get in and start working and be much more productive much sooner in that process.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I will move on to Annalise Midgley.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both very much for coming in. I'm going to ask a couple of questions about overseas labour and developing homegrown talent. So, Jodie, I just wanted to ask you first, how quickly would raising earnings in targeted trades obviate the need for important skilled labour?
Sorry, can you just repeat the question?
How quickly would raising earnings in targeted trades obviate the need for importing skilled labour?
Yeah, I can only speak on behalf of network companies, and we don't use a lot of imported labour. We're very much about growing our own, given the fact that these are quite secure, highly skilled jobs that are needed for the long term. So we find it much more beneficial to grow our own, so we tend to focus much more locally. And given that a lot of our employees are also customers of ours, it's a key part of us in terms of being an anchor organisation. And the jobs we refer to are highly skilled and therefore well-paid jobs already. So from our perspective, we probably don't have a lot to add in terms of the immigration and the importing of labour.
And so the availability of cheap skilled labour from other countries, do you see that as an incentive for companies to avoid the expense of training their own homegrown workers?
I think there is some of that takes place in the sector. We see it in some of our membership areas where that labour is imported at lower wages, which obviates the need for companies to raise their pay levels. So we do see some of that. I think it's a very short-term approach. That's not to say there isn't a role short-term for recruiting some labour from overseas, because clearly there are pressure points. But I think that could lead us into a downward spiral. However, as Jodie's already said, in terms of upskilling our own workforce, that will take time to do that. One of the things I think we need to ensure is that people who are thinking of entering the clean energy labour force have certainty that they will have good jobs there. And that in turn depends a bit on certainty over the direction and longevity of government policy, because lots of people want to work in this area because of an environmental commitment, but they also want good jobs. And to some extent, it's a bit like turning around an oil tanker. So some short-term need, but we do have to be careful about the downside, and we have evidence of the downside.
What evidence? What does that?
Well, in some of the supply chain, we have evidence of workers being imported from Eastern Europe, skilled workers who are being employed significantly below the rates employed by the prime developer, and that has caused difficulties in the workforce. It's caused difficulties with the delivery of that labour.
And what about in terms of, before you were talking about you were both talking about having to develop skills here because of the demand that is coming with these clean energy jobs. So in a previous session, it was said that some of the labour coming from overseas has undermined our apprenticeships and vocational training in terms of getting these skills homegrown here. What's your views on that?
I think in this sector, a lot of employers have good apprenticeship and graduate programmes. I think my view is, in terms of flexibility, I probably differ slightly from Jodie on this. I think what we've got to have is more routes in for people so that we've got an expanded and more inclusive workforce. So I think there's an issue here about the intersection, if you like, of qualifications and competence and how you certify that competence. I would certainly like to see other routes in. I think some employers, some big employers are doing it, like in EDF at Hinkley Point C, where they have vocational routes for people without those academic qualifications to demonstrate their competence, which then allows them to progress onto apprenticeships. So I think it's, I'd like to see flexibility in that way, not a lowering of standards, but different routes to allow a wider group of people to be able to progress into these roles.
Yeah, I had the opportunity of visiting Hinkley Point C, and I saw that firsthand. Just finally, again, in the previous session that we had on this, it was suggested that the government could place conditionality on the use of visas so that employers increase investment in skills in return. And to both of you, do you think this would be a reasonable way of looking at a solution, part of the solution to this?
Yeah, I'm going to repeat what I said. From a network company perspective and from my organisation's perspective, we do have sponsorship licences, but we use them in very limited circumstances for those niche skills that we need now, whilst we develop them in the long term. So it is not something that we use as a key talent strategy in our organisation.
We would strongly support the use of conditionality, and I think there are levers that are readily available to government, for example, through contracts for difference, and through the direct investment we're going to get through the National Wealth Fund, Great British Energy, and so on. And I think you have to do that to get a system-wide approach. Whilst some employers will be doing good things themselves, what we need is a system-wide approach. And actually what we do see is loss of skilled staff from employers who are good at training and developing to those who haven't trained and developed, but will just pay a slightly higher wage. So that's not a solution. We need a broader solution to that. So very much we would support conditionality. We would also say that government might also need to look at regulation and regulatory incentives as well. And whether the remit of Ofgem, which I know is under review, is right for the times that we're now in, and whether it does enough to incentivise workforce investment, I think is a question to be addressed.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Sue Ferns, I'll come back to what you were saying about bringing new entrants into the workforce, which is very, very, very encouraging. And I've heard from some in the industry that they're very keen on attracting young people who've been out of education and training and employment. How do you see, I mean, the example of NQC is very encouraging. Is there a broader policy lever that you can recommend about how we increase the number of people potentially available to come into the workforce?
So I think you can use conditionality in award of government contracts as a policy lever, but I think you will also find local authority leaders who are very keen to engage in this. I've talked to the leader in West Cumbria who knows exactly how many needs there are in that area and is very keen to work with employers and government to get those people routes into employment. So I think it's for government to set the tone through policy, be very clear about that, set some conditionality and then provide support for that to happen.
And does the DWP have a significant role here?
DWP must have a role for sure, yes.
Yeah, without going into a whole other inquiry into work and pensions, what do you think needs to change? What are the simplest changes that the DWP can make to enable the kind of attraction of workers into the industry?
Well, this isn't my area of expertise either, but I have read the recent consultation document about pathways into work, and I think without having much expertise in this area, there is something about not penalising those who are out of work to take on and to try out work opportunities. As I understand it at the moment, it's quite difficult because you would lose income if it doesn't work out for you, and there needs to be, I think, a more nuanced approach to that. But as I say, it's not my area of expertise.
Yeah, thanks very much. Jodie Coe, is there anything you want to add on that topic?
Yeah, in our specific experience, particularly when we recruit into entry-level roles of those that may have been out of work for some time, the key enabler to make them successful is work readiness. And perhaps there's some policy or regulatory change that allows, to Sue's point, allows them to do that transition, not lose out in any of the sort of benefit system that they've got, whilst they get settled into the world of work. I would definitely think that would be quite helpful, and we see that in our entry-level jobs at the moment. And I think work readiness as a concept is something that, from an industry perspective, would be really helpful.
Can I just add briefly to that and say, look, I think trade union representatives have a role to play here. Union learning representatives have done a great job in supporting people, acclimatising them to the workforce, mentoring and guiding them. So policy, yes, regulation, yes, but I think, you've got that on-the-ground support as well. This is a highly unionised sector, full of people who care about their industries, but also about their communities. So I don't think we should forget the role of unions in this regard.
That's right. You have very neatly moved into the questions that Torquil Crichton's probably about to ask you, but that's fine.
Whatever that. Thank you, Chair. Thank you both for coming in. And Sue, yes, you just anticipated my question, what role trade unions could play in pathways into work. But earlier on, you also mentioned that it was a question of resource as well. I presume that's resource in the FE sector, in the college sector?
Yes.
Yeah.
Clearly, the FE sector is under-resourced in this regard. I think there's two things I would highlight. One is I think they need that certainty to invest in new programmes, and that's got to be, I would have thought, a minimum of 5 years for them to invest and set up new programmes for people in this sector. The other thing is that the kind of trainers and assessors you need to certify competence, there is a huge gap in pay between what they earn on the tools and what they can earn in the FE sector. Now, I know that some companies are topping that up to ensure that there are enough assessors, but there's got to be something done about that gap, because it's unsustainable. You will not get enough workplace assessors if they can go and earn double or a lot more on the tools themselves.
If I may add, energy and utility skills are sort of quoting for the energy sector to stand still. We need to sort of replace about 150,000 workforce over the next sort of 2 to 3 years. That's not without the net zero transition, and that's due to retirements. Now, we see a great opportunity even internally in industry to get those to be trainers, so that sort of philanthropic give back sort of scenario. But you're right, so we absolutely have to make that attractive, because they're earning overtime, all those sort of additive things that come with working on a 24/7 operation like a network. So how do we enable that transition that allows them to stay and work longer, do that mentoring training role, and there is a question around the growth and skills levy again, and using that to train the trainers and giving them that competence to do it, and keeping them whole from a financial perspective, whilst they do that role. So agreed, it's a known current barrier that we have that we're trying to address.
Yeah. Encouragingly, I saw that approach at Tarrant Wolf in Belfast just the other week. We're going to welders teaching apprentices full time. That's their job basically, and I've seen it in Arnish as well. And Hinkley Point is always pointed out as the example of how to do it. But we've heard evidence from other people that there is no clear pathway for people to retrain or upskill for jobs for clean energy in 2030 or beyond, decarbonising homes beyond that. Jodie, can I ask you, what has to happen between industry and education to get a clear pathway, to get that?
On the sort of reskilling piece, I think it's industry being clearer around what skills and competence that we're talking about, and what accreditation or credit you can get from skills acquired elsewhere, and making that more readily available. I mean, we have some great individual examples in our organisation around, for example, a retired fireman who then came and did 55, then came and did an apprenticeship to be an overhead linesman, and turns out they're very good at climbing poles, firemen. But he had to go through a 2-year apprenticeship scheme to do that, when actually if the standards allowed it, we'd have been able to get credit from elsewhere from the work, the experience that he's brought. But that's not systemic, right? That's just one example. So how do we work with the education sector to make those opportunities readily available, and work with the apprenticeship standards or the skill standards to enable it to happen more quickly? So I think industry need to work better with education, and DFE need to work better with industry to make that happen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Claire Young.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both. I want to ask a couple of questions about how we cover the costs of skills training and skills and training. So, Jodie, if I can ask you this, we've heard public investment could crowd in private investment in skills and training. Can we expect larger employers to cover the costs of training along entire career paths, from apprentices through to regular upskilling and reskilling of older workers as you progress towards clean energy? And if not, where should the public investment be directed?
It's a great question, and as I said in my first response, industry absolutely have a huge responsibility to deliver whatever the regulator sets out to do and what the customer asks for. So I do think the heavier weight is on industry to do that. And so by allowing policy, changing policy around the investability into the network to enable net zero unlocks that ability for industry to then go and deliver those skills. And then we're held to account on that in the regulatory price control deal that we have. That said, public spending has a role to play, particularly in the education space, so that they come to us sort of with a level of work readiness, and then we then develop the specific competence needed to deliver the role that they come here to do. But I think the key to unlock that is that making policy from an Ofgem perspective, unlock that investment, which gives certainty over the long term, which then enables us to do it. Because, like I say, it's a long-term game. The skills develop skills for the long term.
Thank you. And Jodie, you said earlier that filling workforce gaps would take years. Perhaps if I turn to Sue, would you expect those gaps to be resolved quickly if there was more public funding available to address skills training in low carbon sectors, or are other barriers more of an issue?
I think some of the skills gaps potentially could be, particularly for workers that are transitioning from other roles into these sectors. I think evidence shows there's quite a common thread of skills between jobs in the clean energy sector and more broadly in these kinds of roles. So where there's a small gap between what is required and what exists now, I think there could be public investment to help that along. In terms of the longer term needs, I think Jodie's right. Employers need to do more. They haven't had perhaps as much certainty as they've needed. To the government's credit, we've got Clean Power 2030 now, we've got Net Zero 2050. I think what we would like to see is the industrial strategy and the NESO strategy, the spatial energy plan, which will provide even more certainty. But I think, a key role for government and for the public purse is developing the skills at an early stage, because a lot of them do take a while to develop, take 2 or 3 years to develop. At that stage, it's not clear necessarily where those people are going to be employed. We know there will be a skills demand for it, and that, I think, is the role for the public purse. Employers, I think, could do more and hopefully will do more as the policy certainty becomes clearer. But if they don't, I would say that government should use its levers around conditionality and requirements to ensure that employers do invest as required.
Thanks very much. Annalise Midgley.
Thank you. You've both talked about how this sector is a sector that is highly skilled, well paid, good terms and conditions, and highly unionised. So I just wanted to ask a bit about transitioning from high carbon sectors into low carbon sectors, and I'll go to Sue first. How confident are you that existing government initiatives and support for collaboration between the high and low carbon industries will succeed in that successful transition?
So I think there's a good start with the skills passport, and the regional skills pilots, I think, are a good start in this regard. Hopefully they will develop into mechanisms that will make this successful. Look, some of the pushback you will get, particularly from workers, say, in oil and gas, is the skills passport is fine, but it doesn't have a job at the end of it, and these are very highly paid jobs. I think the issue is about providing good jobs. That doesn't necessarily mean that you provide pay at an equivalent level, but a good job is a well-paid job, but it's also a job where you have opportunities to progress, to develop, to have a career path, and so on. And that's what the clean energy sector has to provide, I think. So I think, we've talked a lot about just transition, a lot of us. We haven't seen so much of it happen as yet. And we need to see that happen. So I think, as I said, the Office for Clean Energy Jobs could help in terms of that. I think a key thing as well is about advanced planning. So what we see in oil and gas, as we've seen in parts of the steel sector, is the crisis happens and then we think about the transition. And actually that's the wrong way round to do it. We know what the direction of government travel is. Therefore, we have a fair idea about what skills are going to be required, what jobs might emerge. And I think there is a responsibility of government, employers, unions and education providers to be working with young people in advance to develop those skills to ensure that the transition into clean energy can happen. We can't necessarily do it from a point of crisis. It's got to be advanced planning. I think actually it was done under previous government. The Green Jobs Task Force and the Green Jobs Delivery Group had some useful ideas in that regard about really stakeholders all working together, working in advance, doing that planning and doing it at the point in the communities that are most in need of those good jobs.
And I'll bring you in a second. But you've spoken about the jobs in oil and gas and steel, which are highly paid, and talked about how it's not just about pay. That is a good job, but if you were in a job that was well paid, why should you find it attractive to move into a job that isn't as well paid, and how would that be seen as a just transition? So, for example, we've had previous evidence from the GMB who talk about moving from boiler to heat pumps, but there's a differentiation in terms of that pay, which is quite significant. So what is the incentive and how would you make that, what are the solutions to making that transition actually just?
So it's not a just transition. If you're asking people to take a dramatic fall in their living standards, that's not a just transition. And I think for some people with skills and expertise that are in demand internationally, they will choose to take their labour outside of the UK. Look, I would say this, wouldn't I? But the way in which, a key way in which you ensure you've got good jobs and raising standards, including not just pay, but things like health and safety, is by having union voice and worker voice. And I'm not saying that necessarily would happen day one, but that is another way in which you will raise standards in the clean energy industries. And I think it's an important part of any government policy on conditionality. And at least I don't think it's an answer for oil and gas workers who are facing job loss right now. I'm not sure that there is a just transition for them right at the moment. Depends on their circumstances, but as I say, this needs a planned approach and it needs pressure from all sides. So it needs government policy, but it also needs work within companies and within organisations to give workers that voice to ensure that standards can be raised organically within those organisations.
Thank you. Jodie?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is the point that I made around the number that Energy Utility Skills is quoting to enable net zero. We're looking at 600 to 800,000 new jobs. And we can't keep doing what we're doing today because we won't fill those jobs and have the skills to fill them. And I just agree with Sue. It's being long-term in the view, being clear on the investment strategy, so that then unlocks the certainty for organisations to say, I can invest in this in the long term, I can open up skills passports, I can work in the long term with FE and government to say, well, how do we do this? Which by default will create those high value jobs and will create that positive workforce environment that we all absolutely yearn for. So that's the thing I would add.
Can I just add more positively? So if you look at it from an oil and gas point of view, it's really very challenging. But I think we all know there are lots and lots of jobs in this economy that are not good jobs, that are poor quality, low paid jobs. And for those groups of workers, there is absolutely a good transition to be made into parts of the clean energy sector. So I don't think we should forget that either.
You think the government should extend activities in the North Sea?
We don't have members in the North Sea, so we haven't got a policy position on that.
That answer was almost good enough to be a politician. Melanie, on, please.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, on the clean energy jobs, there seems to me to be a disparity between clean energy job prediction numbers and clean energy job created numbers, and that one of the big issues we can talk about a just transition. If the jobs are not there, there is nothing for anybody to transition into. So do you think that there is an issue about the reality of vacancies? And you've also talked about the delays and the time that it takes to do the training, but when do we think that the jobs will actually be available to people? Because there is risk involved in training when the jobs are not there.
It's a great question. If I'll point to the recent NIC report, National Infrastructure Commission report, which talks about the need to develop skills for the long term. If we are going to achieve net zero by 2030, we already know we don't have the workforce to deliver that today. But by being really clear on, I keep going back to investability framework, but if you get the regulators to set the right framework with the right regulation and the right measurement to hold network companies to account, we will have to deliver it, otherwise we'll fail in regulatory commitments and not deliver for our customers. Those jobs will exist because they have to, because of the size of the transition and the amount of work that has to be done to achieve the 2030 target and beyond.
So one thing we haven't mentioned so far is supply chains, of course, which are a really important part of this clean energy picture. And the need that supply chains also have for some policy certainty to ensure that they are investing in the skills and the products that will be required as part of the supply chain, because, of course, you're absolutely right, there is a huge gap between job predictions and jobs actually realised, and part of that is because quite a lot of those jobs are being offshored and being done in countries with poorer labour standards but much lower costs. Now, this is a key issue, I think, of energy security apart from anything else, because if you aren't able to manufacture the components and supply chains in the UK, not only do you not have good jobs, you don't have energy security either. So I think that is an important part of the policy dimension.
Thank you. Talk of Crichton.
Just a quick point that we might not have teased out in other evidence is that this skills gap we talk about goes deeper than FE colleges and industry, and it should go back into the curriculum, education curriculum. Your thoughts on that?
I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I'm not a teacher. Teachers will have views about how crowded the curriculum is already. I think there is probably insufficient emphasis on vocational learning now as compared to what there was previously. But I also think there's a huge issue about social inclusion here, because a lot of companies make very good efforts at outreach into schools and colleges. But I know for sure that a lot of that outreach is done into schools and colleges where the students already have good social capital, have good connections. And what I worry about is those schools and colleges where the students don't have that, their parents don't have that. And I think that is a real missing part of the equation too. And probably the only way you address that is by ensuring that it does get onto the curriculum for everybody.
Thank you.
And if I may add, I think there is a big gap in the work experience domain. I have a 16-year-old daughter about to start her GCSE, so it's something that's very close to my heart personally. And the provision around what schools provide in terms of work experience from year 9 through to year 13 is very much dependent on the pupil themselves, and how, and to your point, how privileged they are and can their parents get access to the work experience. And it's a huge gap. And perhaps there's something around, again, working in collaboration with DFE and things like that, is around, well, how do we work with industry to enable good, high quality work experience that raises that ambition, raises that aspiration for all, and then opens up the whole new energy space. And bluntly, that demographic want to work in clean energy. They see it as very important to them. Right. So I do think there's a gap in the work experience space as well.
It's interesting what you were saying there about social capital. You both confirmed it. I was a member of the Education Select Committee 12, 13, 14 years ago, hearing exactly the same point. It's about time we made some changes, and I'll move over to Luke Murphy at that point.
Thanks very much, and good to see you both. One of the big calls in the written evidence that we've received is for greater collaboration between government and those involved in workforce planning, so trade unions, businesses, educational institutions. I just wonder whether you could say a little bit about how you think that collaboration is working. Does the government need to be more engaged, doing more engagement with trade unions, with businesses in the sector, or do you think the engagement that's going on is sufficient?
Speaking from our experience in Prospect, we don't see it in practical terms, except in very small patches. I don't think it is the norm or the expectation that you would consult with your trade unions on workforce planning.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to navigate the landscape with government. We're not in the public sector, for example, so it can be quite difficult to navigate. There is some pockets of some really good work, for sure, particularly locally. But it's identifying the areas that are going to have the biggest impact and then going at them, so it's not boiling the ocean is probably what I would say. And working really closely with the trade bodies is a good route to do it. So I've mentioned energy utility skills. They've done a hell of a lot on workforce planning already in the energy utility sector. Lots of really good data that we certainly use. And the same with the Energy Networks Association as well. They're growing that capability. So I think if there's anywhere I would suggest the government collaborates more, it's through those trade bodies, because then you get the voice of the entire industry, not individual companies. And to Sue's point around the trade unions, again, we're heavily unionised. Prospect represent a big proportion of our professional technical workforce. And we work very closely locally around these sorts of issues, but one company alone won't solve it, so it definitely needs to be a national approach.
Could I just also add to that? There is no regulatory requirement on this either. As energy unions, we year after year push Ofgem quite hard on workforce planning, workforce resilience, and the response we always get is that's up to the companies.
What kind of engagement have you had with the Office for Clean Energy Jobs?
I've had good engagement with the Office for Clean Energy Jobs, regular consultation with them, and we hope that will continue. It's obviously they're in the stage of developing proposals at the moment, so our hope is that in the next couple of months, as we see the industrial strategy and the spending review, those engagements will continue, but they'll evolve from consultation about what might happen to how we work together to deliver.
Do you think there's enough working across government? So do you think the Education Department is involved and Skills England is involved in the way which it should do in terms of workforce planning? Is there enough join up between government departments?
From our point of view, Skills England seems to be lagging behind what DESNES are doing through the Office for Clean Energy Jobs. It may be that they're doing it, we don't have visibility of that. I guess a concern we might have is, obviously they have potentially a very important role to play, but is that role going to be sufficiently focused on, based on industrial experience as opposed to qualifications? Qualifications are obviously really important, but I don't think you should be thinking about qualifications in a context in which you're not being informed by industrial experience.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not aware of any close collaboration between Skills England and DESNES and things like that, so I won't be able to comment. But absolutely, it's back to that point around we have to engage with industry on it, because we'll be able to very quickly get to the key competencies and skills that's needed both in the short term and how you develop them in the long term for sure. So I would definitely encourage it more.
And just finally, we obviously don't want to wait until 2030 to see whether the government's workforce planning has succeeded. What are the things you're going to be looking out for? How should we be measuring and monitoring whether the workforce planning that the government is undertaking is succeeding? What are the things you're going to be looking for? What are the markers of success?
So I think we'll be looking for impact on jobs and communities in the run-up to 2030, but also what the longer-term plan is, and how that plan is going to be delivered, what the plan is in terms of engagement. Look, I don't think anybody expects that the Office for Clean Energy Jobs will have the answer about exactly what the combination of technologies is by 2050. So I think it needs to be a dynamic plan on which the Office for Clean Energy Jobs are consistently working with key stakeholders. So it's about what can be delivered in the short term, what's the plan for the longer term, what's the engagement look like around that longer term plan. But also, as I said, I think a really good outcome from that would be to be able to demonstrate maybe in a couple of industrial clusters what actually has been delivered by 2030 and what difference that has made to jobs, communities, GVA, if you like, in those areas.
And just to add, being a network company heavily regulated by Ofgem, of course, and we are measured quite significantly because we're regulated on the outputs that we commit to in our price control plan. So there's a source of data there already that tells you, okay, how much an organisation investing in skills, how many jobs are created, how many reskillers have they got. There's a wealth of data probably already available. It's just drawing that out and then delivering, and that can show the impact for sure.
Very quickly, is there any country around the world that you see, or government around the world that you think does workforce planning well?
Yeah, I can point to a report that was done by the High Value Manufacturing Catapult back in 2020. It was done with the Gatsby Foundation in HVMC, funded by Innovate UK at the time. And they talk a lot about Singapore as a model. And they have, I'll call them proper technical colleges for specific roles. So if you imagine it in the UK, could you see a distribution network technical college who are developing the cable jointers, developing the overhead lines techniques that we need, developing the data analysts we need for the energy system, and they do that when they leave school, they go and complete that, and then they go out to the workforce already trained and already skilled, and then it's the war for talent to fight between the distribution companies to do that, and that's how they do it, and it seems to work very well. So I'd look at Singapore.
Can I just add to that and say, I think data is really important, and having verifiable data is really important. But I think you also need to be able to tell a story to people. People like you, people like us will look at the data, and that's really important that we interrogate that data. But beyond this room, where people don't talk about clean energy or green energy, they just talk about the jobs that they might get. We have to be able, a measure of success for me is I have to be able to tell that story about what difference this has made to those communities. And I think we need to be able to do that by 2030.
I agree. I would say we probably need to do it in the next 18 months to 2 years, way before 2030. And certainly on behalf of the network companies, we have loads of stories. I talked about the fireman one. We have a maths teacher who's transitioned to be a power systems engineer because he's very good at maths, funny enough, and it's a lot of maths and physics in that type of role. And trying to find those stories and really promote it as an attractive sector will be key to unlock it. I agree totally with what Sue says.
Thank you very much. And that concludes our questions for the first panel. So Sue, Ferns and Jodie Coe, thank you for your evidence.
Thank you so much.
Order.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Spent you.
Yeah. Order, and welcome back to panel 2 of our session on workforce planning today. And I will ask our panellists if you will kindly introduce yourselves, starting with Leah, please.
Hi there, I run a company called Your Energy Your Way. We install solar panels and heat pumps. We're a very small company. We employ 13 people, been going for about 7 years. And we have a particular focus on getting more women into the sector. So we're set up as a social enterprise. We're still a limited for-profit company, but we are a social enterprise that is trying to get more women into the sector.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm a self-employed consultant. I do client advisory services in the fields of housing, construction, decarbonisation and energy planning.
Great. Well, thank you both for being here. And similar questions to the questions I asked the first panel at the start. How much of an impact would you expect a national workforce strategy to have, and how quickly would you expect to see it make a practical difference for employers and for workers?
I've been thinking about this quite a lot, and I think we're used to workforce planning where there's familiar situations like a large single employer failing, or we need particular skills like a shortage of lorry drivers and we need to resolve that. And with the net zero transition, we're trying to do something very, very deep and significant, probably one of the most significant things in all of our living memories, which is strip carbon out of our society within about 25 years' time. And there's multiple challenges aligned with that, just in terms of the numbers of people, in terms of the range of trades and professions, in terms of the depth of those skills, and in terms of how those skills need to collaborate and integrate. And as well as there's practical challenges, like how do you spend £600 million well? How do you move from a system of quite fragmented small pots of funding that sometimes pull against each other into something more coherent and aligned? And also there's quite significant strategic outcome risks. So if we do decarbonisation badly, we will create unhealthy homes, for example, because we won't have got the ventilation right, because we won't have the skills to do it properly. Also, there's lots of societal outcomes deeply embedded in decarbonisation in terms of the quality of our housing, mitigating fuel poverty, economic resilience for SMEs, employability and skills and training over the very long term, because we're talking about a very hands-on set of skills. And I think we need some sort of strategy to bring all of that together into one place. There are some caveats which I'll leave to one side until you wish to explore those, but I think in principle, yes, for those reasons I've given.
Thank you.
From my perspective in our sector, if it can do something to get right down to the granular level of detail of who are we going to train to fit heat pumps and solar panels, then that would be very useful. Because at the moment, there seem to be some people who are saying, well, all you need to do is retrain all the gas engineers. And then there's another group of people who are saying, well, actually, that's a really aged workforce, many of whom won't really be employed, perhaps not by 2030, but certainly by 2050. So we shouldn't be looking at that skill set. We should be looking at new apprentices coming in. And then you've also got the issue of reskilling workers, which is not at all clear how you do that in our sector. So if it actually could get into the granular level of detail about those kind of questions, that would be very useful.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Chair, can I just pick up that you asked about when might it take effect? So one comment I was going to, which I'm happy to explore with the panel if it's helpful, but I think we tend to view the clean energy transition as adjacent to construction, when actually my specialism is construction, and a lot of these skills, this investment, flows through the construction sector. In your 26th of March session, I think it might have been yourself that referenced Modernise or Die, the Farmer Review, which articulated construction as quite a dysfunctional sector. And I think one of the constraints on an effective national workforce strategy is how it acknowledges that dysfunction and responds to that dysfunction. I think if it can be, if it can act as a framework that pulls those levers that counteract dysfunction, then it can have an effect within 5 years. I think without acknowledging that dysfunctional risk, it might just add noise rather than signal.
Yeah, thank you. We've had a number of pieces of evidence that focusing on green jobs misses the point that these skills are required in the economy, regardless of whether they're to do with the clean energy transition or not. Should the remit of the Office for Clean Energy Jobs explicitly cover retrofit and other roles which are outside the Clean Energy 2030 and other and transition workforces?
Let's go first.
So if they can perform a role which is to straddle across several government departments and deal with one of the key challenges, I think, is that there's a pressure to do this cheaply, to deliver heat pumps and solar cheaply, because somebody has to pay for it, and it's got to be government or it's got to be homeowners. Where does that money come from? Versus the pressure to do it well. And so there's inevitably pressure within government of cost versus delivering quality jobs and delivering training as it's done. So if the Office for Clean Energy Jobs can have a role in kind of navigating that challenge, I think that would be incredibly useful, because there's a lot of pressure on me as an installer to install as cheaply as possible, but also to install as well as possible and to train the next cohort of workers. So how do you square that?
I think that's a good question in terms of the remit of the Office of Clean Energy Jobs, in the sense that you have a lot of upward pressure on the numbers needed, and that comes from the need to build 1.5 million homes, the need for a retrofit. Even finger in the air statistics suggest that when we have a national programme of retrofit running at some sort of stability and equilibrium, they're going to be transforming about 20,000 homes a week. So there's those pressures, and then there's the clean energy infrastructure, the civil engineering, etc., etc. So that boundary puts a wide boundary around clean energy jobs, but I think that makes sense to include retrofit, because we're not going to have clean energy or net zero without domestic retrofit and without it running at scale reasonably soon. If you look at the carbon budget we have, even a sort of gentle projection of housing retrofit burns up all of the carbon budget. And also there's a lot of sectors that have decarbonised quite effectively, power generation and industry in particular. And so we're starting to enter the diminishing returns. And so we're going to have to tackle tricky stuff like housing. And so I think that's partly what should be in the remit. But the other thing, as you've suggested, is worth considering, is that those jobs bounce between, the SME supply chain bounces between civil engineering and domestic work and retrofit and new build and other bits of work. So you need a remit that's going to encompass how the sector works in reality across that spectrum.
Thanks so much. And I'll just say this, the Minister is now speaking, responding to the debate, which means we're going to be voting at some point in the next few minutes. So when the bell goes, I'll suspend the session. But we will keep going until that point, starting with Claire Young.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome both. Tom, in your experience, how effective has the delivery of skills been when managed at the local government level?
There's a lot of passion in local government for skills, because they understand that skills are the route to better employment, to some sort of job security, to a way to progress in life. I think they're quite heavily strained by the capacity they have, and we're all aware of the funding constraints they're up against. But I think where they can be effective, they are. I spoke to a few people I know in the sector just in terms of preparing for this, and the frustration seems to be more about the way that, not the amount of money going into skills, but the way it tends to be split into different pots, trying to do slightly different things. It's quite fragmented. One person I spoke to said, time is my most precious commodity, and I spend a lot of it just applying for small pots, to put small pots with small pots. So I think they're very they can absolutely see the value, and certainly the one I'm more aware of because of the area where I live is the North East Combined Authority. They can see that connection between the green economy, skills and employment, economic growth, and that's featured within their local growth plan, the draft local growth plan. I think some of the where it becomes more problematic is firstly their capacity, and secondly the way the overall investment program is designed.
As a sort of supplementary to that, have you seen any difference where we've got combined authorities as opposed to where it's being handled by individual local authorities?
One person did comment to me that having single settlements and blocks of funding that last for a longer period of time makes it much easier to plan. One of the problems in construction and education is they work on much longer timescales, so 5 to 10 years ideally. And so the closer you can get to a single pot where you can orientate it around outcomes and you have a certainty or continuity in terms of the longer term, that makes life much easier.
Okay. So is the problem in sourcing locally skilled labour in construction simply a matter of pay, or would you say there are more complex reasons?
Is this to me or to Liz?
To Tom, sorry, yes.
Again, pay has consistently not come up as an issue. It's probably more helpful to look in terms of programmes that work well. So where you have programmes where there's a good connection with employers, so people can do site visits and employers can come in and talk to them. Employers can help shape programmes. Where you have on-site hubs, Efficiency North in my region are very good at doing on-site construction hubs, where you are receiving training on-site for jobs on the site where the hub is based. The role of experience is also important in terms of weather, because construction is an all-weather job. Some of it is quite cramped, quite dirty, even if it's well paid and quite skilled. And so the more exposure that trainees can have to the real world of construction, the higher retention is. And another aspect is how colleges seek to retain people in construction. The other advantage of that real world experience is if you think you want to be a bricklayer, you get some real world exposure to it and you find out you don't. The question becomes, well, how can we retain you in construction even if that's not the route you want to go down? So it's issues like that that have come up rather than pay. The other thing to quickly mention is the cyclical nature of construction. It is very stop-start, and government programmes sometimes exacerbate that. And so you tend to have people that come in, get on-site experience, get trained, and then because of the cyclical nature, there's a downturn, they're let go, so those skills leak out, and it's very hard to then get people back in again. So there's more that can be done to make it less cyclical.
Leah, how easy is it for an individual firm like yours to pass on such costs to consumers, or will consumers simply put off retrofit? I'm talking about the costs of delivering skills.
Yeah, so for us, we very much target the high quality end of the market, and in doing so we are able to charge a premium because we have considerable cost because of the 4 apprentices that we employ. In general, our customers are quite a specific bunch of customers who appreciate what we're doing, but they are the fortunate few. In general, people want this done well, but they want it done as cheaply as possible. And often people don't actually like very much the idea of having a trainee working in their home. They want to make really certain and sure that they're being incredibly well supervised, that they're not going to have any issues. So yeah, passing on that cost is a real challenge unless you're in a bit of a niche bit of the market that we seem to have found ourselves in.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Luke Murphy.
Thanks very much, and welcome to the witnesses. You started touching on this subject a little bit earlier with the chair, but how relevant is the government's definition of a green or clean job to the running of your business, Leah?
Largely irrelevant. People who work for me want well-paid jobs that they get some satisfaction out of. Sometimes that satisfaction is derived because it's also benefiting the environment, but that's an added bonus rather than being the be-all and end-all of the job. I would say when it comes to promoting these jobs, that can have more relevance when you're trying to tell the story to teenagers or to anyone really who might want to come into the sector, that these are clean jobs. That can be part of the story, but primarily people want a job where they can be rewarded for their work and have reliable employment.
Anything to add, Tom?
Yeah, there's various cohorts that enter construction, and if we get a chance to talk about career pathways, then it becomes more relevant to that. But if you are a graduate, the idea of working in a job that connects to sustainability and decarbonisation and organisational values is more important. This is a bit of a crude definition, but if you're coming in as a much younger entrant, it's much more about, can I earn enough when I start to wash my face? Is it fairly local because I don't have a car? Can I get my on-site portfolio completed? But again, an essential feature of construction is that 98% of the construction sector are SMEs. So the language that most SMEs will use will not necessarily be in terms of clean and green. It'll be in terms of a construction role, or a well-paid, or a skilled or respected role. And also the other thing, as I said earlier, is people don't sort of channel in construction the way that we think they do. The roles are very interchangeable in terms of the sites and construction projects there are not interchangeable. They move about sites in different types of construction projects quite frequently. So it's very hard to put a boundary around it in terms of how we speak to potential entrants. It's sensible in terms of the Office of Clean Energy Jobs, because at that level you can bound it. But it's less helpful in terms of new entrants, I think.
And then in terms of attracting people that wouldn't, I was very familiar with the Farmer Review, did a lot of work around that at the time. But there is an issue around diversity, for example, in construction, in terms of the breadth of people from different backgrounds that are attracted to the industry. I wonder whether you think there's any particular language or terminology that's useful to open up the opportunities to ensure that they seem attractive to people from all backgrounds and attract more people, more diverse workforce into the sector, whether that's a green job or anything else. Like, what's the most effective means of bringing a broad spread of people, attracting broad spread of people to the industry?
I think it's less about language and more about the ability to be able to pay them a decent wage, because one of the big challenges we find taking on people who are in their 20s who I think often if you take on a diverse workforce, you tend to take on a slightly older workforce. I think if you're taking on people at kind of 18 or so, you're more likely to get your archetypal construction kind of entrance. But if you're looking at people of a more diverse background, it tends to be slightly older people, and so to take them on is just an awful lot more expensive. You've got to be paying the national living wage. There's all sorts of extra costs. They're very much not probably living on the bank of mum and dad anymore. So cost is a really big thing if you're going to get that diversity of entrant, because people are generally older.
I think that there's two sides of it, and the first is there's a number of peer networks that have been set up in construction to try and welcome people from across a much broader spectrum. So the National Association of Women in Construction, for example, there's various peer networks that are trying, I think with a reasonable degree of success, to present construction as a dynamic, challenging and welcoming sector to be in. There's also the Construct and Excellence Network. It's got its Generation for Change network, so that's for 18 to 13-year-old people in construction, again to offer that mutual support. I'm not sure to what extent changing the language would help. I think that the bigger issue tends to be that construction works on different timescales and with two often government programs, and that causes a lot of misalignment. So in terms of those wider ambitions that we have for the construction sector, they're constrained by the nature of most clients tending to base their work on cost and compliance. It tends to be fairly short term. They're quite bad at articulating pipelines. They're not very good at articulating what success looks like and how they're going to incentivise it and how they're going to reward it. And so you have a number of issues like that. That
when you say they, you're talking about
clients.
Yeah.
Large and small. Infrastructure tends to be slightly better because it is necessarily working on much longer term timescales. So I think the diversity is affected more by those bigger issues than necessarily a sort of inherent hostility to it in the sector.
Do you think anyone should be using really the term clean or green jobs other than the Office for Clean Energy Jobs? Is it helpful for anyone to use it? Should we just be talking about high quality, skilled, well paid jobs as long as they are, and just leave that kind of language?
That's where I would go
for definitional purposes.
I think it has some merit, but it's not the be all and end all. You've got to have the other stuff in place first. You've got to be providing good jobs. If you're also going to attract a certain cohort of people because they are interested in a green job, then yeah, that's great. But it's a plus rather than the core.
Thank you.
Talk Crichton.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you both for coming in. Tom, it's fascinating to hear what you mentioned there about skills hubs, on-site skills hubs, and I wonder if they're run by the industry or by colleges or further education, and what kind of collaboration
they're often
you see between the two, and whether that's sufficient.
Yeah, they're often a mixture of the two. It tends to be an example of where collaboration between the educational sector and the construction sector and clients has worked quite well. So the organisation I mentioned was Efficiency North, which has established a couple of on-site hubs on the actual construction site. The construction site has to be of a reasonable size to support one, because obviously you need to be training people who have a reasonable chance of being a part of the pipeline of employment on that site. Another example, again from the North East region, is there's an architectural practice, global architectural practice called RIDER, who established Plan B, with B standing being BEE for Built Environment Education. And again, that's about attracting people into professional training. So building services engineering, for example, those sorts of professions. So industry is I mean, not all of industry, because like the people, there's different companies with different motivations and what have you, but a lot of industry is very keen to get people on board. I'm quite heavily involved in the Construct and Excellence North East network, and you meet a lot of the supply chain there who are, love the construction sector and want to bring people on board, and out of that comes some quite good collaborations. I think one of the things the National Workforce Strategy could look at addressing is shifting some of the skills funding towards a more outcome focus. So, and I think that's a potentially a big gap. So your criteria for success become much more about how can you collaborate, what partnerships can you build, what are the skills and training outcomes you're going to develop, how are they going to be measured, and then you're allocating potentially more substantial pots over a longer term. And I don't think that would increase the spending. I just think it would redirect some of the fragmentation and the messiness.
Okay. That works at scale, but as you said yourself, a lot of the construction is through small SMEs, small medium-sized enterprises, and can they be expected to take the risk of taking somebody on, training them up?
Again, a lot of SMEs are willing to do that, but far too many SMEs operate one contract away from failure. So you're asking them to do something that actually potentially bets the farm. Mm-hmm. So if you are an SME in construction, it's a sweeping, but it's true enough to be a barrier. You operate in a low margin environment on short-term contracts. You're measured by cost and compliance. There's a lot of risk stumping, and there's frankly quite dodgy payment terms and contract terms. And so a lot of institutes of technology or LSIP partnerships ask those SMEs to participate in what they're doing, and people can't take the risk. They can't take time away from revenue earning activity to spend half a day in a workshop. They can't take on people for 3 years when they can only see 6 weeks ahead. Mm-hmm. When Carillion failed, for example, there's more recent examples, but they swept away thousands of SMEs in their wake. There's a huge amount of stress and financial loss for that whole you know, for all of the SMEs that were dependent on that, the payments from that supplier. They didn't have the financial resilience to survive that. And you're asking the same SME chain to take on quite long-term risk.
Do you have an example of good practice where SMEs are in a position where they've got those longer-term certainties?
I'll hand over to Leah, because I think you're keen to talk about your...
Which was going to be my question as well. Is there a way around this? Is there other examples?
So I do know of one boiler manufacturer that now manufactures heat pumps that have taken on a sizable cohort of apprentices, but they are not employing the apprentices. They have actually given them free of charge to local SMEs, which I think is a fantastic initiative, because you look also at the...
Name them and praise them.
Oh, name them and praise them. I'm never sure if I can name... So it's Valent. They've taken on a group, and they're making them available to local companies.
Has that been done under like a transfer of the levy?
I don't know the exact mechanics, but yeah, that was going to be another one of my points really, because we can access levy money in order to pay the fees for our apprentices to go to college, but I mean that's a minuscule fraction of what we have to pay to take on apprentices. It costs us around £30,000 a year to afford an apprentice if they're on the national living wage. That's not including our £20,000 insurance bill, a sizable portion of which is made up of having four apprentices out on site. So these costs are vast, and so much of the money goes to... Is that your bell? Do you need to go? So much of the money goes to training colleges, and more of it needs to find its way to SMEs.
Thank you both.
Right, well, thank you very much. We will suspend the sitting and come back after what we think is 3 votes. Order. Order, and welcome back to the second panel on our workforce planning inquiry. And Tom Jarman, I think you have another example for us.
Yeah, your colleague asked for examples of SME in the context of apprenticeships. This is an SME who have a particular model in terms of skills and training rather than apprenticeship. But they're a Manchester-based SME called B for Box, and I think it's worth drawing the committee's attention to their model. So they take on unskilled trainees and skill them up over the course of the following period of time. And those trainees are paid a full-time wage during that training period, which obviously includes a lot of on-site experience as well. And their retention is very, very high. They do occasionally lose trainees. So I mentioned earlier that construction is quite cyclical, so you'll get an upturn, you'll get a spike in demand, and so they will have trainees that leave because they're getting paid quite considerably more at another company. But that tends to be a very short-term spike, and then they're let go. But other than that, their retention is very, very high. But the benefit to the trainees is, unlike college, where you might receive a bursary, a small bursary or assistance towards travel, you are paid a employment wage for getting trained up. Earlier witnesses have spoke about conditionality, so letting contracts with particular conditions attached in relation to workforce planning and employment and skills. I always think conditionality is a bit of a bolt-on trying to cope with dysfunction rather than a helpful thing in itself. The ultimate conditionality is what the client wants the contractor to do and how they're going to recognise that and reward it, and over what term they're going to form a partnership with that contractor. And the B4 box model works because they contract directly to the client. And a lot of main contractor models that are used by clients, the main contractor takes a 20% margin. And then actually an SME sits at the very tail end of that contract. And because there's a lot of issues, a lot of areas of spend that you can't do much about. You can't do much about health and safety spend or welfare or materials or contractor margin or client margin. So the bit that gets squeezed is the SME margin. And so that's why often SMEs end up working at the tail end on the short-term contracts, low margin, etc., etc. So it's worth, if the committee are visiting Manchester, it's definitely worth reaching out to B for Box because it's a really interesting model. That doesn't mean that model should dominate the construction sector because some main contractors do a very good job, and sophisticated clients are very clear on what they want the main contractor to do for that 20% margin. And where you have that sophistication, it works quite well. But B for Box are a good model in terms of how SMEs can operate. And like I say, I do think conditionality can be a bit of a distraction. I think we need much, much better clienting, more sophisticated clienting.
And so the good practice is B for Box.
B as in the capital letter, 4 as in the number.
Okay, B for Box. And it's direct contracting rather than losing 20% of margin via an intermediary.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, that's very, very interesting. Thank you.
Could I also highlight something that would help me as an SME to employ more apprentices is the fact that whenever I take on an apprentice, part of the conditions that I sign with the college are that I can't put any conditionality, different sort of conditionality, on the apprentices to pay back any of their training costs should they leave after a year, 2 years, 3 years. That's actually against the terms of my contract with the college who are offering the apprenticeship. I think that model worked a long time ago when people kind of stayed with apprenticeships for a long time, and it was kind of part of a network, a familial network or whatever. But now it's a big risk as an employer to take someone on and train them for 2 years, maybe 3, maybe 4, just to have them leave. And I know in a lot of the more professional jobs like law or accountancy, it's really common to say that if you leave within a specified amount of time, you will be liable for a portion of the cost that it's taken to train you up. And as far as I understand it, that's not allowed.
Okay, thank you very much. Vera Hophouse.
Thank you. This section is a little bit about required skills level and widening participation. The committee has sort of already established in previous session that ultimately raising standards is not really the issue around recruitment. Would you agree? There are other issues why recruitment in the sector can be tricky, and we can come to that, and we obviously want to sort of tease out a little bit that it's not the sort of the raising of the standards bit that is really a problem, it's other things. But first of all, would you agree that because we're trying to sort of understand the balance between would that raising standards have a knock-on effect on recruitment, or is that not really the problem?
My view on it, so there's a lot of people being recruited into construction. We need a lot more to be recruited, which is where the workforce strategy and the Office for Clean Energy Jobs have a very, very clear role. But actually the issue is more about retention. And we've spoken about the things that impact on retention already. It's, in many cases, it's more important to have that discussion with employers, because there is a handover point from a college environment, to an employer environment. And it works well when that handover point is clear, when employers are engaged in shaping it, and when there's a clear relationship that means the portfolio completion can take place. By standards, I assume you mean to what extent, what depth people are trained.
Yeah, for the green construction future.
Yeah, so I think with the national workforce strategy, there's a really, really key regional component to that, because the regions differ a lot in terms of what resources they have, what the challenges are, how construction projects are located, what construction projects are dominating, etc., etc. So I'm slightly wary of using a national strategy there are key things a national strategy can pick up, but it needs to be a framework that's quite regionally based, I would think, because then at a regional level you can determine the standards with employers that work best for the situation in that region. So for example, in the northeast there's a relatively high percentage of wards with indices of multiple deprivation. There's a high problem a big problem in terms of the number of NEETs. There's generations of families where they have worklessness generation after generation. So the response to that is going to be very different to a regional strategy in London and the South East, for example.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. In Surrey, we see a very different problem, which is that we want to attract the high quality applicants into the sector. So having higher standards and having a well-recognised qualification that gets you into the industry actually helps those people to feel like they're getting really good jobs. So it's exactly the opposite problem.
But in terms of underrepresented groups as well, or the long-term unemployed, is there anything that where you see more in order to widen that participation? What is it that stops participation in those jobs? Is it, for example, childcare? Is it any of those, long-term unemployment? What is it where you think one could widen participation?
I think this is where I think it's more of an opportunity rather than there's necessarily a particular barrier I can think of. So career pathways are quite a good way to visualise how your career in construction might flow, what the start point might be, where various routes might take you, what the pay looks like, what the progression milestones look like, etc., etc. So if you have a starting point, for example, of being, maybe not your attainment in school isn't that great, you've got a history of unemployment, construction is really good because it's hands-on, it's a very people-focused profession, and it takes place all over the country. And I mean, just retrofit alone, there's a 30-year pipeline of work there, so there's enough to make a career out of that. So I think it's more about two things: the ability to visualise, and that's quite intense and needs quite a lot of support, but the ability to visualise what that progression might look like. So if you are in that position where you genuinely, and I've worked with kids who are in this position who think, right, I'm fed up of mucking around and I want to make a go of this, you can see a starting point. And then the regional component is shaping that programme so it responds to reality on the ground in that region.
I would say also that the ability to get the apprenticeship, so to have the employer to work for, is a big barrier, because I come across lots of people who are trying to get into the industry via this college course and that college course, whether that's private training providers or government training providers. And they may well go, and some of them are even hoodwinked into going on what look like excellent training courses that are going to get them into the industry. But if they haven't managed to secure that work experience, that person to let them drive around in their van with them for the day, then it's really, really hard to actually get into the sector. And the way those jobs flow, the way those experiences are doled out in the SME sector is largely between family and friends. So, I make a point whenever I meet people who've kind of come into the sector of asking them, how did you get your first opportunity? And it's a cousin or a brother or an uncle. So if you've got a group of people that those jobs are flowing between, and you want to widen the pool, there has to be a way of people from a different cultural background or different gender background to get access to that opportunity to travel around in the van for the day.
Can I ask one short question around job centres? Do you think there's any role for job centres to support all of what we have sort of discussed today, or more support for job centres, or more guidance for them of how they can help applicants?
I think Leah's right in the sense that my experience as well is that the route into construction for a completely new entrant is generally friends or family or word of mouth. So you'll have an uncle who works on a building site, and you find out they have an on-site construction hub on the building site, and it's that sort of connection. I don't know job centres well enough to understand really how they might fit into that, but certainly I can imagine they would have a role in terms of articulating career pathways, because in construction you can have a relatively inexperienced entry point, and that might be something that job centres can connect with.
They also help with applications, actually. If you go to a job centre, you support an application and that sort of thing. Sorry, I know that the chair wants to move on. I was just wondering whether you had any ideas about how to support.
Can I just give some follow-up information that, or are we short of time?
No, you carry on.
To some extent, where that would work is in the more formal entry points. And there are plenty of programmes out there. So I spoke to one social landlord recently who works with a main contractor in terms of their retrofit programme. And I spoke earlier about main contractors taking quite a large slice, which they do in this case, the 20%-ish slice, which they do in this case. But there's a very clear understanding from the social landlord in terms of what outcomes they get from that slice. And that includes good quality employment and training outcomes. And so I can see a job centre helping with that sort of more formal route that gets people trained. So the main constructor's got their own academy, and they put people through that, and then at the end of the academy process, which includes their on-site experience, they get a job with a main contractor or with a social landlord. One of the problems with that, and this is where I mentioned earlier about some of the government programmes, that was quite dependent on Warm's home funding, the social the funding for social housing retrofit within that. And with that allocation being cut to 40% of the bid, that completely disrupted all of the planning around that programme and how it was due to operate in terms of that pipeline and flow. So there are bigger issues in construction and within programme design and clienting that a national workforce strategy will sit within, especially if you're looking at formal routes into employment, which are dependent on predictability and pipeline and longevity.
Thanks very much. Bradley Thomas.
Thank you, and welcome Tom and Leah. A couple of questions for you both. So, to what extent do you think that existing market signals and incentives will drive demand versus, say, a local authority-led programme to catalyse retrofit? And if there was a large-scale programme in the local authority sector, to what extent do you think that would draw demand away from the owner-occupied centre and present a shortage in that segment of the market?
We will give you some time to think about your answers to it while we suspend the session and go and vote. Order. Order, and welcome back. Bradley Thomas.
Thank you, Chair.
Repeat your question.
Thank you. So my question to you both is, to what extent do you think sort of the natural activity in the market and incentives that are there will drive demand for those seeking to upskill and transition versus, say, opportunities that arise that are catalysed by, say, a public sector or local authority approach? And if there was a large-scale public sector or local authority retrofit programme, do you think that would be to the detriment of the owner-occupied sector that would see a shortage in demand for skills as a result?
Yeah, I mean, to take the second part of your question first, absolutely. Part of the problem with a cyclical marketplace is that a response to that is to push up prices rather than necessarily recruit and grow. The other risk it creates for owner-occupiers is that as the more professional marketplace, members of the marketplace withdraw onto big contracts, that leaves a space wide open for some of the people that should not be touching domestic property. Most private householders will judge a contract by the cost of it, which is understandable because they're not construction professionals. And as one of your earlier witnesses was saying, there's no barrier to entry to become a builder. I could call myself a builder tomorrow. So it actually creates quite a lot of risk as well. Well, one of the problems is that we tend to view skills as something you get if you put the financial input in. And I think one of the things I talk to clients about is the triangular relationship. So you have clients who are the ones actually investing the money with the supply chain. And skills will work most effectively when the supply chain are engaging with the educational sector, the FE sector, and demanding particular skills. And the only way they will do that is if clients reward the outcomes from that skills training. And that's a big gap at the moment in terms of how that flows. So we get quite a lot of input funding into skills, hoping that will match some of the demand that might come from the supply chain. And we've talked about the nature of the supply chain, when actually the supply chain is responding to what clients are asking it to do. And if clients don't have a consistent pipeline of work, they don't have a consistent ambition, they're not very good at articulating what they want the supply chain to do, they're operating in a short-term, transactional, cost and compliance-driven way, then those things aren't going to match together. So you're going to get a situation where a large-scale investment will have effects elsewhere that are unhelpful overall. And so I've spoken already about how we need to think much more in terms of outcomes. So, what outcomes do you want from skills and training? Because you're not investing in it because you want people to sit at a desk at college. You're doing it because you want to improve life chances. So we need much more outcome thinking, and we need better construction clienting. And that's not completely within the government's remit, but the government is a very, very significant construction client. I mean, the Warm Homes Fund is a massive investment in the retrofit marketplace, but it's the programme structure is quite poorly designed. The term is quite poorly designed. There is much more it could do, such that it translates into sustained skills rather than short-term responses to chunks of money.
Yeah, it's about that consistency and trying to move the construction sector away from this cyclical boom and bust problem, and government at the moment is not helping with that, and it definitely could, because if as a business I could happily do with some bread and butter work that I knew was like a regular pipeline of work going forward, that enables me to decide what people I need to take on. Homeowners, all sorts of different things happen. Downturn in the economy, promise of new subsidies, which we heard today, may well actually have a negative impact on my business, because people sometimes hold off waiting to see what the next thing is. So that homeowner work is not reliable for me as a business. If I could have undergirding that a steady stream of work from a local authority that prioritised the fact that I'm training apprentices, that would be fantastic. So I think it's finding a way to make those things work together so that as the homeowner demand grows, which it does a little bit patchily, perhaps there's an ongoing consistency from government schemes could be really, really helpful.
Can I just say, in terms of most SMEs I've spoken to, their attitude is very much, I don't want a guaranteed contract, but I want a shot at a contract, and I need to know what I want to do to get that contract. And if what you need to do is skill your people up, that's what they'll do. The other thing they're desperate to do, and it's a point consistently made by Construction Alliance North East, is they want a chance to use their skills and experience. At the moment, the way we procure supply chains means they have very little chance to do that. They either work through main contractors, or the exam question is, how can you do this as cheaply as possible with a bit of social value put in? So that's a bit sweeping, but the marketplace isn't really challenging them. And ultimately, a lot of the response we want to decarbonisation, to jobs, are challenges around spending the money we already spend much, much better. We need a much clearer focus on productivity and innovation. And so we need to create an ecosystem in which SMEs are rewarded for their contribution, because then they have no problem doing the things we're asking them to do and participating in the way we're asking them to participate. They just work in an ecosystem that has a lot of barriers to that actually happening in practice.
Thank you. Leah Hophouse.
Oh, sorry. In your experience, how responsive are individual workers and smaller employees to changes in government skills funding? I mean, you've already touched on some of the government programs. So, when the government has got a very big stake in it, then obviously it's a government's responsibility. But what about those, the employers who are private employers?
My frustration is the emphasis that the skills funding is always about college courses or about sitting in a classroom. So if I want to train people up, I really want to take them on and primarily have them on the job, being mentored by my experienced engineers and learning how to do the job. So the offers that I see from government funding are 3 or 4 day courses to teach you to be a heat pump engineer, or they are skills boot camps where people go for 5 or 6 weeks to increase their skill level. And that doesn't do what I need it to do as an employer. I need some support to be able to mould people on site. And I think we've just got to get away from this idea that sitting in a classroom looking at PowerPoint slides, which, I've done a lot of industry training, and that has always been my experience. You sit in a classroom and you look at PowerPoint slides. That is not a good way to train people to have good retrofit and heat pump, whatever, renewables, installation skills.
If you're looking at the sort of skills gaps, I think you've already mentioned it in earlier answers, that it takes time to sort of, from the beginning, and then get people through the whole, of a career. And so what could a government do short term to address the skills gaps problem? What type of funding, what policies, what frameworks would you, if you were the government, sort of put in place?
One scheme, and it's still a very small scheme that I've seen that I think is fantastic, is Nesta are running a scheme where they are making available a heat pump to a heat pump installer who's been on the 4 or 5 day training. Because to just go and do the training and then have to try out your first heat pump install in a customer's house is difficult to arrange and quite nerve-wracking. So instead they are funding installers to have a heat pump that they will install in their own home, so that they can actually at least get their first install under their belt, because it's not just about doing the short course. It can be something as simple as just enabling you to do that first installation. So moving from being a gas engineer to actually having hands-on fitted a heat pump from start to finish I think would have a real impact.
just to confirm, those are those first installs always supervised?
So these are trained people who've done the training, and then they are then fitting in their own home. So
yeah, but you were talking about where the first install is in the customer's home. Is that supervised?
Oh, if it's typically in a customer's home, no, it wouldn't.
It's not supervised.
No, not normally. No. So you could do the 4-day course, and then you are then a trained heat pump installer, and nobody needs to supervise your work at that point.
Yeah, and other examples of incorrect installation?
We see terrible installations far too frequently, I'm afraid. Yeah.
And do you attribute? Sorry, but
no, absolutely.
Do you attribute that to the lack of quality of training?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's
but would you think that having sort of a heat pump that you can mess around with, if I may say, in some sort of small employer's place, where people can really try it out, what works, what doesn't work, that would really make a difference? Or is that what you're saying?
I'm saying more the opportunity to actually install one in a home. So rather than it be in a college, in a training centre, these heat pumps are actually being given to people to go and install in their homes. Does that answer your question? Sorry.
I'm trying to sort of understand how I should think about it. So you're given the heat pumps and say install it in your house or
in your house,
in their own homes.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Understood.
Yeah, that's it.
Another example you might be interested in with that sort of hands-on practice in mind is I think it's from 2016 or so, but the Fabric First Institute in Norwich, where Norwich City Council was developing its new build programme based around the passive house standard. And to build passive house properly, you need to be quite highly trained, because you do need to get the integration of all the interfaces and components.
Yeah, would you mind just explaining passive house?
Oh, sorry.
Please.
So passive house is a standard for new homes that's a very low energy standard. And so the Fabric First Institute was an example of where the supply chain came together to provide materials, and a house was built within the warehouse, and trainees were, supervised but largely let loose on the house. And the point of it was they could do stuff to this construction and use thermal cameras and thermal imaging, and they could make mistakes and get things wrong, and then see the impact of that, so they could understand, that's why you don't drill through an air tightness membrane. So there's lots of quite good examples of practice out there.
But shouldn't they then also write a write-up of this went wrong, and this is you can a script for people to avoid the mistakes they've made? Shouldn't that be part of
that sort of guidance is quite widely available, but there's nothing quite like getting your hands on something and being able to play with it. But that's a bit of a tangent from your original question. I can't think of much in the very short term that can be done, because to some extent a lot of the employers that are interested in that and the colleges that are quite proactive in this space are doing things that try and mitigate some of the structural problems we're having. In the longer term, we're talking about sustainable supply chain growth, and that's much more of a cultural challenge, which doesn't say it can't be done, but it is quite a challenge in terms of how we understand funding, how we articulate outcomes, what sort of term we let the funding over, and also the government, and not this government, the governments over the long term have tended to get quite involved in the detail when they really should be, in many cases, stepping away from that and being much more focused on this is what we want the investment to do, and you can access the investment if you can show us how you're going to get to that point. So that's a slightly longer term challenge, but that's one of the ways to more sustainable supply chain growth.
Right. Well, thank you very much for your evidence. That is the end of our session. Order.